Okay, so in this video I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the kind of misconceptions about keeping snakes over water, juveniles, humidity, and these kind of things. Not so much as like, oh, I've got to try to convince you to keep them this way, as it is defending keeping them this way, because there's some logic out there that I don't agree with in terms of why this is perceived, I believe incorrectly, as being really risky to keep snakes this way. So I just want to start off showing this is a baby emeraldtreeboa, baby northern emeraldtreeboa, and this is a typical setup that I do for the babies, where it's kept over a very thin layer of water, about a quarter inch or less, usually about an eighth of an inch, and a simple little garden fencing perch with some fake leaves for security. And then if you notice in this tub, I've got a ton of holes all through the sides. So lots and lots of ventilation. Now, one of the things you should notice about this setup, and this is one of the first misconceptions that you see, that I see a lot about keeping them over water, is the assumption that, oh man, you're keeping them soaking wet all the time, when the reality is actually the opposite. The animal itself is not wet at all. The leaves are not wet, the perch is not soaking wet. You'll see the walls of the tub are not wet. That's because I have so much ventilation going on there. Now, the advantages that I consider there to be keeping them over water here is that it's extremely simple to keep them at a high humidity that's stable. They have access to clean drinking water at all times right below them, no matter where they choose to perch in the tub. And I know this is part of the debate, is whether they're drinking dirtier water or not, so we're going to explore that in a minute. But basically, the advantages that this provides is a nice, stable, high humid environment, because yes, these snakes need high humidity. I don't know where this idea is coming from, especially lately with some people on the internet, that these species, that emeralds and chondros, don't need high humidity. To me, it's kind of ridiculous, but if you're keeping your snakes with too low of relative humidity, you're going to see obvious signs from that, and one of the most common ones you'll see is the stuck shed skin. Stuck shed is an obvious sign of too low of humidity. I don't believe it's much of a hydration issue. It's tied into it a little bit, but the reality is I think that you're going to see consistent stuck shed problems, or if you are seeing consistent stuck shed problems rather, that's almost always going to be a result of keeping the enclosure too dry as far as relative humidity, and it gets even worse if you are spiking it way up and then it's drying way out, and spiking up and drying out by spraying the enclosure. Now, one of the things I wanted to point out is a little bit controversial, especially these days with a lot of obsession over fake rain. I do not spray my animals at all. I stopped spraying them, that includes the neonates. Stopped spraying them about 2 or 3 years ago, kind of ramped it down 3 or 4 years ago, but stopped altogether when I hatched my second greentreepython clutch. I wanted to see, do these animals actually require these fake rain droplets or not? And my experience has been they absolutely do not. If you provide high enough humidity, and if you provide clean, drinking water for them that's easy to find, they have no trouble finding it, they have no trouble drinking it, they respond to it when you change the water. But one of the things that's interesting is that these snakes, I find, unlike snakes that are shown on the internet a lot, that are being sprayed and then they dry way out, and then sprayed and then dry way out, they don't guzzle water the instant it's in front of them desperately, which I do see, particularly more so with adults. A lot of people are keeping the neonates humid enough whether they're spraying or not, but with the adults in particular, that desperate guzzling of water as soon as it's available from the mister or the spray bottle, to me, is a sign of a dehydrated animal. A thirsty snake is going to drink very eagerly. A snake that's well hydrated is going to drink more casually, and not going to appear as desperate. So, and I think the issue there, at least this is my thought on this, I think there's some parallel with what's going on that people have seen in the chameleon community. and that their chameleons in captivity were observed to, routinely run to the misters as soon as the misting system turned on in their enclosure, and trying to drink the droplets, and they drink from a dropper. And then these animals were studied in the wild and found that they don't drink that way at all, that they appear to be getting all of their hydration through the actual fog that occurs at night in their environments. Now, I don't think that that's exactly the same case with emeralds and chondros, but I think there's a parallel there in that if the animals are not being kept humid enough, they're drying out, quite literally. So they are chronically dehydrating every single day. Every time they're put through that cycle of spray them and then, wet the whole enclosure down and wet the snake's skin down. But then because the relative ambient humidity in the room and the enclosure is so low, you're basically constantly battling a rapid decline in relative humidity. The snakes are, the animals are just literally drying out. And that's why they're so desperate to drink when the misters come on, and that's why they're having stuck shed problems, and probably contributes to prolapse. I would almost be certain of that. So these kind of issues are pretty easy to solve. You don't have to just keep over water, but whatever you do to keep the humidity high, I think particularly for the neonates, but the adults as well, they need to have that pretty stable high humidity. And when I say stable high humidity, I'm not talking 99% humidity all the time. You know what I mean? But 70, 80, even sometimes 90% for a good portion of the day, if your ventilation is correct, is not a problem. And there's keepers that have been doing this for a long time. I'm by no means the person that kind of figured this stuff out. I've just been following the people that I consider to be true success with these species that came before me with this, and a lot of them share those same kind of observations. And I've seen it myself when I made the change, that keeping these animals at the higher relative humidity and keeping it more stable, and spraying less, in my case not at all, has resulted in animals that are far more stable as far as their shed skins are consistent. They don't seem to have any issues with hydration. They don't desperately drink water as soon as it's put in the enclosure or anything like that. So just a little to finish up what I'm saying on here. In a tub setup like this for a neonate or a juvenile, they'll move them up to larger tubs as they grow a little bit. But in this situation, they're kept over that thin little bit of water, and that's it. I don't spray them at all. The water gets changed at least once daily for the juveniles, or as soon as it's soiled, then I dump it out, and that's that. So it gets changed minimum once a day. I check it multiple times a day to make sure they haven't soiled it. For the most part, these snakes are going to defecate, sometime within the first few hours after the lights go out, or they're going to defecate. I've found that they'll also defecate very early in the morning. Now, sometimes it's random, but for the most part, that's what you'll see. So those are the times I check. I try to always check around those times that they're likely to have defecated recently, so that way they're not having to be exposed to dirty water for very long periods of time. So I guess that's a good point, a good place to transition to this discussion of the risks of keeping this, or the supposed risks of keeping these animals. And the big risk that everybody's afraid of as well, that's, they're going to drink dirty water, or at least that's one of the main ones. They're going to, drink dirty water, or like I said, they're being, they're constantly wet. But again, the reality is, as far as the animals being constantly wet and their enclosures being constantly wet, the enclosure here is actually constantly dry other than the floor of the tub. The snake's skin is almost always dry in terms of it doesn't have water sitting on it. It doesn't have water droplets standing on it. So that argument as far as the enclosure being kept too wet and the snake's skin being too wet and running risks of having infections and things like that, if you do this correctly, this is not a problem at all. It's particular if you're using clean water. If you're using questionable, if your city water is not clean enough, if there's an issue there, then you might get an issue even if you were keeping them with proper ventilation this way. That's why I recommend, if you are going to keep them over water, I use RO water, and I get that from the machine at a local grocery store that has the purified water you can get, and you can actually mix it with the alkalized water as well. So I do a mix of those two. But you know, clean bottled water works. Whatever works to have some good, clean, purified water should be fine. I don't think you should use distilled water. That's generally not recommended, so just use bottled or some kind of purified water for that. All right, and I apologize if this video is a little rambly. I'm just trying to do this all in one take so I don't have to edit a bunch of shit. Hopefully it comes out all right. So, keeping them this way, let's address some of the kind of controversial aspects of this, whether this is safe, whether this is a disaster, this supposed huge risk of them drinking soiled water or not. So we're going to take a look. I'm going to take this perch out of here for a second and take a look, dump the water out of this tub so we can kind of make a point here that I want to demonstrate. So we've got two typical 6-quart tub setups. It wouldn't really be any different if this is a little larger. You can see these are identicals, no trickery going on here. Now, the thing that when I was trying to decide whether I was going to keep, you know, raise neonates over water or raise them over paper towels, I did a lot of research before I hatched my first chondro clutch and looked at people both keeping emeralds and chondros and trying to kind of pay attention to like who's really truly having success with these species versus, you know, people that maybe appear like they're extremely successful but don't necessarily have a lot of numbers to back that up. So I started looking at some of the guys that, you know, really had numbers in terms of, you know, producing high numbers of this species consistently for years with really good results, really good reputations, rock solid animals, and just had a good consistent you know, method of doing things. And I came across a few different people that I was inspired by early, that I noticed were not, they did not spray their animals, or at least not very often. And they were either keeping them over water, or if they were keeping them over a different substrate, they weren't spraying them, or again, not spraying them very often. So a couple of the guys that, you know, the main guy that I ended up being probably the most inspired by, or two of the most people rather, in the chondro world was Michael Cermak was a big one. He was an Australian chondro breeder that is retired now, but he produced who knows how many hundreds, or I think probably potentially thousands of chondros during his career. And he did a lot of innovations in outdoor cage keeping as well. So, you know, in one of the videos I saw on him, he discussed how he does not spray his animals at all because he keeps them all at around 80% or so, you know, in the ballpark of 80% relative humidity, and doesn't need to spray them. Now, again, this should be kind of a light bulb going off in terms of whether these animals need humidity or not, because even if you're not keeping them over water, if you spray them, whatever you're doing, I mean, everybody's trying to make sure that the neonates are kept at a proper high humidity so that they don't have all the symptoms of dehydration. What I don't understand is why it's, for some reason, it's like once they're juveniles or subadults, and especially into adulthood, if those same symptoms of dehydration show themselves, stuck shed, you know, having issues as far as prolapse, you know, lack of exercise, lack of activity, these kind of things. For some reason in adults, it's like it's okay, it's no problem, or it couldn't possibly be a humidity issue. I don't really understand why there's such a difference in terms of, you know, why the symptoms are viewed as problematic in a young animal, but not problematic in an adult. Anyways, I'm rambling a bit more here. I'll just one last mention. Definitely got to give credit to Ed Marino, who was one of my biggest inspirations for working with emeralds in particular, but also in the way that I keep. I mean, a lot of what I'm doing is based heavily off of what I saw him do in his videos and discussions and posts, and it's worked extremely well. So he keeps over water. I know he still does spray. I don't know exactly how often he does, but he does spray occasionally. But we've talked a bit, and he definitely recommends not overdoing it in terms of the spraying. And I just went ahead and went all the, you know, 100% of in that direction. I just don't spray them at all. And I mean, my animals have never looked better. That's the interesting thing about this. You know, for some of the people that might argue that you shouldn't be keeping them, you know, high humidity, or you should with such high humidity, or, you know, they absolutely have to be sprayed. if I'm to be perfectly honest, some of the people that have that approach or that mindset, I look at their animals and I compare them to mine, and it's like, yeah, I'm not really sure you should be as confident in your statements as you are. So anyways, moving on to this, I'm going to just demonstrate something that to me was one of the kind of deciding factors or kind of, you know, moments of realization that I had with this when I was doing my research. And just coming to terms with that I had no desire to do this paper towel setup situation. And I just want to show something simple because this is something I see all the time. And, you know, I initially was going to do this, and then I really had to take a look at it and go, what the hell is the point of this? So I see this kind of setup consistently. And again, this is not a big criticism of this. I'm really not trying to come off that way. I'm sure some of this is going to sound that way, but I'm just trying to point out the differences here and really more so point out all the similarities, because I think we're splitting hairs here in terms of risks and in terms of the way some of these things are done. So this is a typical way that, you know, about the typical amount of water I would use to put in the bottom of these tubs. I don't measure it, I just eyeball it, and this ends up being round about what it is. So just a little bit, so it just barely covers the floor of the tub. It oftentimes doesn't even cover the entire floor of the tub. Now, a setup I see all the time are setups with paper towels that look just like this, where you have a completely saturated paper towel, right? Completely saturated. You have a little bit of sitting water in there. And seeing that enough times, I just realized, well, what the hell is the paper towel doing that's so different compared to this? What is the actual benefit of the paper towel at this point? I mean, I can't see a good argument for it that it's creating any kind of you know, magical health benefit that's going to assist the animal. And so I don't see how this is also going to really do a lot to prevent any of the supposed problems of keeping over water. And here's where I wanted to talk about some of this risk of drinking, you know, soiled water. So if they're kept over water, you know, one of the primary arguments I always hear is, well, if they're kept over water, you know, they're going to defecate in their water. Of course, they're going to defecate in the water, and so then they're going to drink the dirty water. And I don't want to have to change it every day because, you know, I'm too scared they're going to drink the dirty water. Now, what doesn't make a lot of sense about that is that anybody who keeps these animals, reptiles really in general, but particularly arboreal snakes, these snakes love to defecate in a water bowl or in a water source, period. So placing a water bowl inside there, you know, I see pictures of this on the internet all the time, and I've experienced it when I've kept snakes, you know, tried keeping a few like this. They're going to go out of their way to defecate in that water bowl. Happens all the time. So once they defecate in that water bowl, your snake now, you know, the idea that it's going to just go and drink out of that water bowl, that dirty water bowl, or it's going to drink out of here, it's an assumption that it's going to drink that dirty water. I don't think it's really going to go out of its way, especially if it's well hydrated and kept properly humid. It's not going to be desperate for water to where it's going to immediately, you know, take a shit and then just start guzzling the shit water. Most of the time when I've seen them, they actually drink first and then shit later. So I think if anything, they're going to be already hydrated before they you know, go ahead and take a crap. They're going to drink the fresh water when you change it, and then they'll crap later that night. But let's say that it does take a crap in the water here versus the water here. Now, if you're not changing the water daily with this, and you don't, you know, if the argument is that, well, I don't want to do this because then I'd have to change the water every day or stay on top of it. Well, what do you do if the water is dirty in here? If you're not paying attention, if you're not checking to see if the water has been shit in, then they're absolutely at risk of drinking that water. So, you know, that right there to me is something where it just didn't make a lot of sense. Now, in particular, if you're keeping the snake where it's a paper towel substrate and it's completely saturated on the bottom like this, the snake can also drink from the floor just like it can in here. So if it sits on the paper towel, anywhere on the paper towel here, then you're at risk of it potentially, you know, messing getting in and drinking that foul water there. Now, again, personally, I think this is really splitting hairs in terms of the risks here, because I don't think, as long as you're changing your water frequently and you're staying on top of this stuff, this isn't really a huge risk. I mean, you're no matter what scenario you're doing, you're going to have some potential risk of the animal drinking soiled water. And that's the answer to that, is just, you just got to stay on top of it no matter what you're doing, whatever your setup is. So again, I just want to point out here, in a situation like this, if the snake shits anywhere on the tub, on the soiled paper towel, and even if it's not completely saturated, but particularly if it's completely saturated, at night when that snake is moving around and active, it is absolutely potentially crawling around through the urates and defecation on the towel, especially if it's been allowed to defecate and urinate multiple times on that paper towel. Then the chances of it crawling around through that and then crawling through its water bowl are quite significant. It also is going to crawl around in its water bowl. A lot of snakes do this, particularly if you're giving them a decent sized bowl. They're just going to cruise around and explore. They're going to go in their water bowl. So again, if it's shit in the water bowl, it's potentially crawling through dirty water. Now, another element that happens in here that doesn't really happen in here, in terms of potential risk of drinking in dirty water, one difference is that in either situation, if this snake takes a dump in the cage, it's in its rack system, or it's got the top on the lid, whatever is going on, it's going to take that crap, and then any particles that are coming off of the feces, getting into the air, are going to be going all around the tub. They're going to be in the air. They're going to stick to the sides of the walls. They're going to stick to the perch. They're going to stick to the snake's skin. Now, in this setup, with what I'm doing, since I'm not spraying the snake, and I'm not spraying the sides of the walls, and I'm not spraying the perch or the leaves or any of this stuff, the snake isn't drinking off of any of those surfaces. In this common setup, being sprayed along the walls, on the perch, on the paper towel, the whole thing, it's encouraged to get the snakes to be drinking droplets of water off of their skin, drinking droplets of water off the sides of the tub, and basically any surface rather than the water bowl. So those particles that have come off the fecal matter are getting everywhere on the tub, theoretically, in either situation, and now the snake has that extra risk of drinking those droplets, like I said, off of its skin. It's crawled around on the tub, crawled through feces, crawled through urates or dirty water, or it's crawled around the tub walls or whatever. Now it's drinking off of its skin, it's drinking off the walls, it's drinking off the perch, etc. Now, I don't think, again, that these are huge risks and that these are actually manifesting in a bunch of problems for animals. I think this, I guess probably the main point of this long rambling ass video is that I think this is really splitting hairs in terms of any kind of risks going on with the snake drinking infected water, soiled water. I think you've got the risks in either setup. You could say that this one has more of a risk of drinking. I guess you could say it's got more of a risk of drinking soiled water because it's a larger surface area. But it doesn't have the risk of drinking the dirty water off the sides of the walls or off of its body, the leaves of the perch. So how much of a trade-off that is, I don't know. Personally, I've yet to watch any of these snakes drink dirty water, so I don't know how much of a risk this is. If there's people out there that see this video, if you have first-hand accounts or even second-hand accounts, if you are aware of a bunch of snakes that had all sorts of problems and illness from being kept over water, I'd like to know about them, because I think the only things I've ever heard of, seen any real significant tangible evidence of, are people that have kept them over water, but basically with no ventilation whatsoever, and they're in a constantly soggy, wet environment, and they're also spraying them. And then they might get some water blisters or something like this, but that also occurs in a paper towel setup where they're being sprayed constantly. So I don't know that this, again, maybe I'm just completely unaware of all this evidence of these animals having problems, but if anybody's out there and has a lot of tangible evidence of, sick animals or lots of problems developing from keeping them like this, I would like to genuinely hear it, because I haven't experienced it yet. You know, I've produced almost 30 emeralds. I've produced about 20, I think, chondros. I've established a bunch of wild-caught emeralds with methods like this without spraying them and just keeping them high humidity and raising juveniles, even a couple of wild-caught ones over water like this. I've never run into any issues. So if people are having significant problems, I'd like to know what they are, so I can make sure I don't run into them at any point. But I think they're all kind of pretty common sense things to avoid. And again, for the most part, they're things that you're gonna still encounter with a setup like this. So anyways, I think I'll probably end off this rambly ass video and just kind of again reiterate that keeping them over water, if done properly, is absolutely safe. There is no major huge risks involved here. I've raised enough snakes already over the last few years to be confident in saying that. When I talk to somebody like Ed Marino, who's been doing it for even longer, you know, it's just becomes even more clear that these are not real major issues. Oh, and one other last point I do want to make here. When it comes to a paper substrate like this and snakes drinking off the floor, I just want to point out one thing that I'd seen in a podcast. It was brought up about observing observing multiple Amazon basins that are kept over puppy pads where the misters spray down the puppy pads. It's like an automated misting to spray down the puppy pads to raise humidity in the enclosure, which is totally fine. But in that podcast, they talked about how the snakes will go down to the floor and drink the water, you know, off the floor of the puppy pad. Now, you can imagine in terms of risk factor there that you're dealing with almost the same kind of scenario, in that if the snake urinated or defecated on the puppy pad, that liquid is going to go all over the place, especially a large snake, and it's going to mix in with all the, you know, water on the puppy pad, especially with the misters basically guaranteeing that it's going to mix in, and then that snake is potentially drinking the soiled water that way. Again, I don't think this is a real significant problem, but I'm just trying to point these things out, that I think sometimes the logic behind this is not really thought all the way through in terms of the real risk factors. And so, okay, as if this video wasn't long enough and probably boring enough, I forgot something to address here. So my light's gone off, it's a little darker, sorry about that. One solution that I've seen suggested that some people are doing, which is not necessarily a bad idea, but I just wanted to kind of talk about that because I forgot to bring it up, is using multiple water bowls in a tub setup like this to try to avoid you know, the issue of basically kind of try to avoid any potential soiled water risk, as well as maintain the benefits of having a large amount of surface area that's water for the slow evaporation for high humidity. And on the surface level, it's a pretty good idea, and it's got benefits in that theoretically, yeah, you know, in theory, the snake will defecate most likely just in one water bowl. It's probably not going to defecate in all of them. So then, in theory, if it defecates in one water bowl, then it's got other clean options to choose from. But this also, again, makes the assumption that the snake's going to do a Goldilocks situation, and it's going to actually, you know, inspect the different water bowls and make sure that it's only drinking the clean one. I'm not aware that there's anything showing that they'll do that. I don't really think there's a huge risk either way. But this isn't necessarily a bad idea on the surface. But there is one thing that kind of, I think people maybe forget about with this kind of setup that makes it not quite as foolproof as it might seem. And that's the particle situation that you have in any of these setups, and that when the snake defecates, whether it's on the floor, whether it's in one of the water bowls, whether it's in both of the water bowls, or if it gets it on the side of the tub, whatever it is, once that fecal matter is releasing particles into the air in the tub, and that's sitting there for however many hours, you know, it's eventually going to potentially go into all of the water sources. And it's certainly going to be potentially on the walls of the tub and perch and snake skin and everything else. So if you're then spraying on top of this, then again you have that same problem of them potentially drinking water droplets that, you know, have these particles in there. Do I think this is a major huge risk for the snake's health? No, not at all. I'm not aware of a bunch of problems that this has caused for any of these setups in terms of drinking soiled water, unless you're talking about a situation where it's just nasty ass conditions. And that's really what the problem in any of these kind of scenarios is if you're keeping the snakes in just nasty conditions where they're having to have, you know, shitty water for days or, you know, up to a week at a time, you know, or it's all over the paper towel or all over the floor of the tub or whatever, then that's obviously the real problem here. Any of these other setups can all work well as long as you're keeping the water clean, you're making sure it's changed as frequently as you possibly can, and just doing your due diligence to make sure the snakes have clean water available. And I think if they're well hydrated and they're properly humid, they're not going to be so desperate for water that they're going to be, you know, guzzling shit water the minute they take a dump. I think that they're going to, you know, probably drink first, defecate later, and then I think you've got a fair amount of time to get that cleaned as long as you're checking them daily. One last thing to talk about, if we're talking about a setup where there's no water bowls at all and you're only spraying them, personally I just don't think that's a good idea to rely only on that. But if you are doing that, you're still not really completely out of the ballpark in terms of risk of, you know, them theoretically drinking infected water, because again, you know, they're gonna unless it's a completely screen cage, then maybe it's less risk there, obviously. But if it's any kind of box like the vast majority of us are keeping them in, then, you know, the fecal matter, wherever it lands, it's going to be releasing into the air, and then those particles are potentially going all over the snake and the cage, and so theoretically it could drink that. If it's a bioactive situation, then I mean, you've at that point you're not really taking the standard approach to disinfection anyways, and you're letting the feces stay in there permanently until the cleanup crew, quote unquote cleanup crew, does its job to get rid of that stuff. In theory. In reality, there's going to be particles all over the place. Does it mean your snake's going to be unhealthy? Not necessarily, but I've seen plenty of examples where that is the case. Probably more so than not. Anyways, I guess that will finally close out this video. I think I've covered all the little things that have come up in different discussions about this that I've seen over the years and that people have asked me questions about, but probably there's a few things I forgot. I'm imagining some people will come at me with some gotchas, and that's okay. I'm ready for them, so come at me.